From Sydney University, Miss Julia Bowes. From Victoria Wellington University, Miss Saika Islam. From Koch University, Mr. Jan Okar. And from Marcus, Mr. Jason Rogers. Ladies and gentlemen, your finalists. From First Government, Monash B. Monash B is represented by Mr. Victor Finkel and Mr. Ravi Dutta. In the opening opposition, we have Oxford A. Oxford A is represented by Mr. Will Jones and Mr. James Dray. In closing government, Harvard A. Harvard A is represented by Mr. Cormac and Mr. Bollard. And finally, on closing opposition, Oxford C. Oxford C is represented by Mr. Jonathan Leader-Maynard and Mr. Alex Worsnip. Ladies and gentlemen, on the motion, this House would ban abortion at all stages of pregnancy, we call this House to order. We welcome the Honorable Prime Minister, who will begin the case that stands in his name.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is somewhat ironic to stand before you in an all-male debate on an issue typically seen as one that is a concern to women only. But we believe abortion is an issue that affects all of society, and one that we believe affects the rights of men as much as it does women. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that abortion has gone too far. We believe that we must bring an end to the practice of abortion at all stages of pregnancy, except where the mother's life is in danger or in cases of violent rape. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that commensurately the state should provide an increase in support for adoption services and an education campaign and the provision of contraception. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that these measures make it sufficient and feasible for people to carry even unexpected pregnancies to term, but we believe that this makes it more likely and in fact in people's interest to make sure that when they get pregnant, they really want that pregnancy. We have 3 points that I want to bring you at the start of this debate. We believe first and foremost that society must value life, that abortion is akin to murder, and that a society that does not value life is one that does not value rights. Secondly, we believe that abortion is incredibly traumatic, both physically and mentally. We believe that this trauma is not sufficiently capable of being addressed at the time when the decision is taken. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I'll explain how we think that outlawing abortion has positive effects on the way in which relationships are conducted. Ravi, my second speaker, will talk to you further about the effects on society and how banning abortion better empowers men in relationships and decisions relating to pregnancy. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to talk about the value of life, because we believe that it's something that we can all agree on here today, that life is the fundamental value from which all rights stem. We believe that abortion at any stage is an end to life. We think medical ethicists have tried for decades to come up with a distinction between when conception happens and when life begins. And they've failed, ladies and gentlemen, because there is only ever arbitrary grounds on which to grant that distinction. We think that some have tried to say, well, perhaps only in the third trimester a baby is fully conscious, ladies and gentlemen. But others will say that at 15 days the nervous system is active and capable of registering pain. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, any stage that you choose to draw is an infinitely arbitrary line, and there is no consensus as to when that line and to when life begins. And we think in that case, we think it is imperative on the state to err on the side of caution, of protecting life. When we're not entirely sure at what points it begins, the answer isn't to draw an arbitrary line. The answer is to not allow the taking of that life in any way, because we think the mistake of taking a life is far more dangerous. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we think the key here is that abortion is the active act without which life will continue and life will grow. This is completely different to contraception, ladies and gentlemen, because until the sperm and egg meet, the active decision is not to make a baby, right? But in this case, the active decision is to end that life, because left unaborted, a fetus will continue to grow and become a fully fledged human being once they have left the womb, once they've gotten through primary school, and hopefully when they stand on stage like this in the future. So ladies and gentlemen, we believe that because of this distinction, we believe that abortion is akin to murder. We believe it's been convenient for states to ignore that. We think that cannot stand. We believe that's the grounds on which we can take people's autonomy to choose to do what they like. We believe that when someone's free choices harm another, in this case, when they harm an unborn fetus, in exactly the same way as the moment that fetus is born, it becomes the crime of infanticide to harm your child. We believe that this is a crime and requires prevention. We finally, on this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'll take it a second, will believe that there is a terrible harm to a society that demonstrates such a fundamental lack of respect for the value of life. Because life is the only objective right which we can all agree on all the time. From preservation of life comes preservation of rights in society. Will.
If you think abortion is murder, why should it make any difference to you whether or not the woman was raped?
Yeah. We believe that there are incredible cases of harm in which we can mitigate and balance the harms in this case. In exactly the same way that self-defense, ladies and gentlemen, is a justification for taking a life. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the other grounds on which we gain is one of the effect of the death of the mother's life. Again, this is a consistent principle. But far more importantly, we're talking about the vast majority of cases where abortion is legal at all times. That's what this debate is about. So the second point I want to talk about, ladies and gentlemen, is the effect of the trauma of abortion on many people who go through it. We think it's a lie to say that abortion is easy. We think there are incredible physical harms that come from it and traumatic mental harms that women who are seeking abortion are little able to comprehend because of the extreme duress and stress under which they seek that abortion. We believe, firstly, on physical harms. We believe that abortion is physically damaging to reproductive organs. That is how the fetus is forcefully dislodged, whether that be through medical means, whether that be through a wide array of highly unpleasant metallic objects. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that women who go through abortion are far less likely to be able to successfully carry a pregnancy to term later in their life. We believe this is a real physical harm. We believe the mental harm is also significant because we believe that the harms and the trauma for women who go through abortion of knowing that they have taken the life of a child that they have carried within themselves is one that they are ill-equipped to deal with later on. We believe people move towards choosing abortion because it seems like the easy option, it seems like the cleanest option, it seems like the best way to put an end to a messy incident that you've gotten involved with. And that's why the pressure is on you to choose to have that abortion as long as it's an option. But we think that the harms and the long-term trauma that come from that is something that you cannot understand at the time, because you haven't taken a life until you've done it. Ladies and gentlemen, my final point is that we believe the point at which pregnancy is determined should be at the point at which you get pregnant with your partner. We believe that this is the fundamental basis of sexual relationships, is one of mutual consent, that you should have access to contraception and education. At the point at which you may have sex without contraception or without sufficient protection and become pregnant is the point at which, ladies and gentlemen, that the consent is given to carry that pregnancy to term. We believe that's the principle we stand on. Ladies and gentlemen, abortion is an issue, a scourge on society as a whole. It hurts women, it hurts relationships, and it hurts all of us. Thank you.
We'd like to thank the Honourable Prime Minister for his speech. And now, to begin the case for Oxford A and the opposition benches, we welcome the Leader of Opposition.
The first thing we want to point out is how odd we think it is that they have conceded that there are occasions where we can kill a fetus or a human being, according to them, in these scenarios, in the cases of rape or mother's danger. They are conceding that murder is not their test. The question at hand here is not whether we're killing someone or not, and we think that's an amazing consistency. We think that what they also do when they say that, well, there are incredible harms that can accrue to the individual in this case, is that they fetishize only physical harms. What we're going to show you are the extreme emotional harms that accrue to a woman in the cases where she is not allowed to have an abortion. But first, and also they said, well, it's not easy for these individuals to make these decisions, and they're actually really hard decisions and bad decisions. Well, we think firstly that the women are best placed to make these decisions for themselves, not the state. But more importantly, where is the best place for them to find out about all the consequences of having an abortion? On a back street with a coat hanger, or from a doctor who's actually able to give them advice on this proposal? What I'm going to argue later is that I'm going to concede that personhood is a bad test. I'm going to concede that we don't really know whether these are people or not. And we're not going to try and say in this other house that we know categorically that they are people. But what we are going to concede, what we are going to argue, is that there are scenarios where even when the other agent is a person, it is still legitimate to remove the life of that individual in order to sustain the life of another. So why is personhood such a bad test? Well, we agree with them. It's hard to work out when consciousness starts. It's hard to work out when this individual develops agency or effective consciousness. And so because of that, we do need to err on the side of assuming that this is a person. And on the side of, we think that the state must assume that the fetus is a person. Now, before you think that I'm standing up on this side of the house, on the wrong side of the house, what are we going to argue? We're arguing that there are scenarios where even if the fetus is a person, it is still legitimate for the woman to make the choice to kill it. Why? Well, a couple of examples. Firstly, in the cases of Siamese twins, no thank you, we regularly decide to save the one that is more able to live in the long term. But more importantly, what we think is let's put ourselves in a scenario. You wake up one morning and you are attached to another person who for 9 months is going to have to, you are going to have to sustain. No thank you. You're not hooked up to a life support machine. If you disconnect that individual will die. We don't think that that's enough for you to have to be hooked up to that person for another 9 months. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Who's going to make you sick? Who's going to make you feel uncomfortable? Who's going to make you feel like you're not the same person anymore? We wouldn't require you to give your organs to another person because that could sustain their life if you could. Because we think that your right to body integrity and control over your own self and your own organs is stronger than the right of another to have a claim on those organs. No thank you. We think this is a scenario where if the woman doesn't want the baby is akin to someone who is assaulting her. She needs to act in self-defense, no thank you, to save herself and to save her conception of herself. They may claim, well, the baby is innocent. We don't think that innocence is a defense. We don't think that even if this baby doesn't have agency, that is a defense. Let's take a scenario. You are attacked in the street by a mad zombie. That zombie has no agency. It is under the control of another person. That does not mean that if it attacks you, you cannot kill it and save your life. It doesn't mean that just because it doesn't have agency, that you can't sustain your life. Now they may say, well, what about in those scenarios? No. What about in those scenarios where your life is not going to be actually destroyed in terms of the physical destruction? Well, we think that there's more harms at stake here than pure physical destruction. If that zombie was also going to perhaps disable you, we think that there might be an argument for you to kill them if that was the only way in that case. If that zombie was going to remove your capacity to lead a meaningful life in the future, to prevent you from, for example, becoming a doctor by hurting your hands, or to prevent you from, no thank you, in the future living a meaningful life, we think that you could also, in those cases, be the one that removed the person, the life of that individual.
So stop talking about zombies. Tell us on what grounds women would be able to seek abortions under your plan.
Sorry, I don't understand. So we're being very clear. When a woman feels that her life or her future potential is under threat, then she can have an abortion. That is what our case has been from the beginning. We think that her future life can be under threat, not just physically, but in the fact that it destroys her conception of herself, which is my next point. Because when you are pregnant, your entire body changes. The hormones have enormous effects on your identity as an individual. You don't become a pure self anymore. You are connected to another person, and your definition of yourself can be changed. You may build up emotional bonds with that other human being that you have no desire to build up. Emotional bonds which might change your conception of yourself and destroy your possibility for future selfhood in the long term. You may grow to hate that thing which is within you, which may change your conception of who you are. No thank you. We also think that these women then, in these scenarios, maybe in scenarios where, for example, they have particularly religious parents, or their position in their community may be severely diminished, or their capacity to make future income can be diminished. And so we're putting these women in positions of enormous desperation, which is what my partner is going to talk about in terms of the practical consequences of this action. But one final point that they may suggest to us is that, well, what if the woman is at fault for creating this person, in the sense that she went out and had sex and then had a baby? Well, we think that you can still be pregnant if you follow all the possible precautions. If you take the pill, if your condom doesn't, or for example, use a condom, and if those fail. But even if you don't, we don't think it's legitimate to demand of someone that they can't go out at night because there's a prospect that they might. We don't think it's legitimate to demand of these individuals, of women in general, that they can't live normal, successful, meaningful lives, of which sex is a large part, just because there is the possibility that they may get pregnant, and then they have to get latched with this baby, which they don't want to be inside them for the whole future. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that even if this baby is a person, the woman still has the right to self-defense. She still has the right to protect her bodily integrity and to be able to sustain a meaningful life in the future, not just when the baby may kill her, but in all scenarios, where the baby may reduce her future income, where the baby may reduce her identity as a human being, or where the baby may just reduce her lifestyle as a whole. And for those reasons, we beg to oppose.
We'd like to thank the Honourable Leader of Opposition for his speech. Now, to further the case for Monash B, we welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're going to assume, from what we heard in response to our POI, that the opposition is happy to have abortions pretty much whenever they want, ladies and gentlemen. That's pretty much what we're going to take from that. So let's move on and look at that. Why have we said when the life is at danger? Why is this different to the case of Siamese twins, ladies and gentlemen? Because there, as in the case that Victor pointed out, the exception that we have, a life is in danger, ladies and gentlemen. And we would say the reason we put rape in there is we think rape is a pretty terrible thing, ladies and gentlemen, akin to having your life in danger. That's why we're happy to have it as an exception. Let's look, however, at the main thing that I want to talk about, which is about when you lose control, when you cede autonomy to this individual. Why, according to the opposition, that this shouldn't happen. Our fundamental case, and Victor brought this up right at the start, the nature of the act of sex implies that you take on those risks, ladies and gentlemen. When you get pregnant, we think you accept the consequences. You went into that sexual act knowing the harms, knowing the risks, knowing what could happen, ladies and gentlemen. You have ceded your autonomy already when you take on those risks. What does that mean? You can't claim, ladies and gentlemen, you can't claim that you have complete autonomy over that fetus, ladies and gentlemen. That your autonomy, the woman's autonomy, trumps that of the fetus because the woman has ceded that when they go in consensually into the act of sex. That's another reason why we have rape as an exemption, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, what we'd say, we think this makes people more accepting and aware of the risks. We don't actually think that contraceptives fail that often. Condoms have like a 99.99% accuracy rate, ladies and gentlemen. But even more than that, in the very rare cases that condoms or contraceptives fail, our model provides support for things like adoptions, ladies and gentlemen. You can have those sorts of things. And we think actually, and I'm going to talk about this later, that the government is more likely to provide those services when abortion isn't an option. And that's good for everyone in society, ladies and gentlemen. But also, moving on, what we heard from the other side was the idea that, look, women can't kind of make choices like this kind of has huge sorts of effects on their personality. What we'd say to that, firstly, in terms of hormones is, like, in terms of their future potential, they can go on. Having a child, you can give that up for adoption and still be able to move on and lead a full life, ladies and gentlemen. Just because you are pregnant, it doesn't ruin your life forever. Under our model, what we're talking about, you have the option to give it up for adoption, and you can go on and realise that future potential of yours, ladies and gentlemen. Because after pregnancy, the hormones do go away, those sorts of things do stop, and you can recognise your full potential. Well, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, but what doesn't change is your changed conception of yourself because you have now been a pregnant person. What if you're a woman who maybe sees herself as a man, for example, internally, and then she has to carry the baby to term? She no longer is able to see herself in the same way anymore.
She should have thought of that before she entered into consensual acts of sex, ladies and gentlemen. That's what we would say to that, frankly. But more importantly, we think that concern is far lower than that of life, ladies and gentlemen. Your future potential is nowhere near that of life. We think that self-actualization is really, really nice, but we'd rather have an extra life on board, ladies and gentlemen. We think that is fundamentally far more important in this debate. I'm going to look at two things. Why this measure, why allowing this kind of abortion undermines support for socio-economic services and government services, and secondly, why this actually disenfranchises men in the process. So firstly, in terms of support for socio-economic services. What do you effectively do when you provide abortion effectively on demand, as that side is doing? Well, what it does is it reduces the burden on the government to provide support and support services for people, particularly in low socio-economic circumstances. Why? Well, because abortion is offered as the solution. The government effectively says that if you get pregnant and you're poor, go have an abortion. That's where they put the funds, that's where they put the support. Why is this problematic? Well, because we think having a child, not having an abortion, is actually quite a legitimate choice. That, aside from our thing, aside from any other consideration, there are people under the status quo, even with abortion legalised, who will take on children, ladies and gentlemen, and not have abortions. Those people are fundamentally disenfranchised when the government doesn't provide services. When the government provides, so the main service and support is through things like abortion, those people, for religious reasons, for example, who choose not to take abortions are disenfranchised and they lose out. We think that is fundamentally harmful because obviously those people deserve support. Like the best way to help those women and to help people in those circumstances cope with the kind of problems if you think they are there, we think the best way to do that is to provide support and support services. We think our model fundamentally does that and increases the pressures and the burdens on the government to do that. Secondly, I want to move on to the disenfranchisement, and I'll take a point particularly for the closing if they'd like to offer one. Anyone? All right, fine. Moving on to men's... All right, go on.
Just because you've established that something is a moral imperative, as your side accepts, doesn't mean that it overrides all other moral imperatives. Like, just because something is the right to life doesn't mean that the state can do any action to protect any person's life.
Yep, cool, but we've told you why in this case in almost every single circumstance the state should do something to protect it, because we think that if you left it alone, that would go on to be a life, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think you've given us any compelling reason to override that very basic principle of society. Like, we got up here and told you the basic value of society has to be life. Without life, there are no other values. Without life, you don't have a society. If you don't value life, quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, what the hell do you value? So, moving on to the disenfranchisement of men. What we'd say is that we think that men actually have a role to play in the development of the child, in pregnancy. Why? Well, firstly, because they're generally an equal partner in the creation of that pregnancy, ladies and gentlemen. And particularly when that act is consensual. We decided to talk about this, the idea that it actually means that it changes the nature of relationships. If you go into a sexual relationship where there is the risk of pregnancy, you know the harms, and it is consensual, we think men should be an equal player in that decision. Abortion takes any kind of stake that men may have in that decision out of their control. It leaves men out of the cold. Now, obviously, men shouldn't have all the control and all the say in the world, but we think it's incredibly important to have men involved and make men think they have a concern and a stake in children's lives, ladies and gentlemen. Like, one of the biggest problems in society, particularly in the United States and African American Hispanic community, is men not being involved with the raising of their children, not feeling involved with the stake of their children. We think actually taking abortion away forces men and gives men the opportunity to get involved with that decision, but more importantly, we think they should have the right to have that decision because that autonomy over the body was ceded in a consensual sexual act where people knew the harms. At the end of this debate, ladies and gentlemen, we say you must value life. You have to value life, particularly when it is a consensual act of sex. We don't think future potential is good enough, ladies and gentlemen. We proudly beg to propose.
We'd like to thank the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister for his speech. And now to further the case for the opening opposition and for Oxford A, we welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
I don't think I've ever in my entire life been quite so convinced that what I had to say in this speech was correct. We were told by the proposition that the woman should have thought of that. I wonder if their response to a woman who walked through an unsafe area at night who got raped was she should have thought of that. She didn't, of course, know what was going to happen. She knew that there was a risk that she might get raped. She consented to walk down the street, but in exactly the same way, random mischance offers the chance that your life will be destroyed. We don't think that women who have sex consent to motherhood. We think that's insane. I have two things I want to talk about. Rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, what is it that a fetus, person or otherwise, may demand of women? We don't think it is indentured slave labour for 9 months. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what actually happens in their world. Because we have all these lovely red herrings about men taking responsibility and about having more wiggle room in the adoption services. We think that's nonsense. We want to talk about the real world. So, what may the fetus demand of us? We think there was an interesting concession with rape, because they said, no thank you. That the rape victim who becomes pregnant may have an abortion on the ground of the massive, massive harm that woman now faces. We want to know, we ask to receive no answer as to why they deem it that they must fetishize purely physical harm, why that is the only type of harm that matters. Sit down. We want to know why they think that there's only one way in which a life can be destroyed. We think there are more ways of dying than just when our heart stops beating, and you sentence women to many of these through this proposal. So, no. We think there's a very simple fact about the real world, which is there are no artificial wombs as yet. Which means, in order to sustain the life of this fetus, no thank you. What you have to demand is the use of another body. You have to demand indentured service from a woman for 24 hours a day, or 7 days a week, for 9 months. And they pursued this. They were like, well, the woman should afford this. Let's be clear before we go there what is lost here. Right? What is lost here is the very basic control over your own body. Your body is no longer yours. You are demanding of it that the state may use it as a baby factory for its own purposes. Moreover, what they say, and again what they know, is being pregnant is not just being a vessel. It is not just being a carrier for a baby which is then produced. Being pregnant alters you. It changes who you are. What that means is it attacks the very basis of your selfhood. It attacks who you are. We think women may justifiably wish to defend themselves against that basic psychological assault. We say that because when you don't want that the fetus inside you, the relationship of the child, of the fetus rather, to the mother is one of assault, the mother may legitimately take self-defense. And unfortunately, the only route of self-defense here is to kill it. Harvard.
Sir, since you concede that a fetus is a person, why doesn't it have the right to the state's protection from the physical assault that you will impose on it?
For the simple reason that the state also does not prosecute people who kill in self-defense when they had no other option. Now, is this different because the woman has in some way consented to be pregnant? Now, they poo-pooed this again on Monash, but they did concede that it is a lie to suggest that there are not cases where a woman can take every reasonable step and still be pregnant. What they missed is, it's rather difficult as a doctor to tell what those cases are if you say the condom broke and it's not your fault. But then what they said is, it doesn't matter because you consented to the sexual act itself. We do not believe it. We simply don't think it's reasonable to say that every time a woman gets drunk, she has consented to be pregnant and to be a mother for the rest of her life. We do not think that's fair. We don't think we would apply the same case to people who are raped in unsafe areas. We think that is nonsense. No. What actually happens here? Firstly, a couple of red herrings. Firstly, the idea that by doing this we give the state more wiggle room vis-a-vis adoption agencies and that sort of thing. Firstly, we don't, thank God, live in societies where we have to make those kinds of choices. This was implicitly set in the developed world, if only because you thought that there were things like adoption services. But secondly, we say what constrains adoption services is not finance, but rather available parents. So that was misdirection by them. Then they said, and I love this, we are going to change what men think about pregnancy and relationships. Despite the fact that their entire prop is based on it's the woman's fault, she got it, she did it, she is responsible and she must suck it up. You say put all the burden of responsibility on women. Guys, we don't think that will change what men think at all. So, one, we don't think that this is going to alter vast amounts of sexual behaviour. Every single law that ever tried to in all history has failed. Therefore, we think there will still be masses of unwanted pregnancies. And we don't, so bear in mind, this is not a world where abortion does not happen. This is a world where people who are alone, people who have no knowledge, people who are in the dark and who are 14 years old can no longer go to an agent of the state. They instead go to the woman with the coat hanger. Right? In Britain in the 1960s, thousands of women were condemned to death by a government policy that said the state would never be there for them under any circumstances. We think the state should construct laws pragmatically. Furthermore, the peculiar evil of this policy is they are right. There are some cases when abortion does not have to happen. We say when you go to a doctor, you have the opportunity to get that information. Someone will talk to you. Someone who is qualified and trained will tell you what the options are, and you may indeed decide with state support to have that child. You are unlikely to get that support from someone you find in a backstreet. Now, we do accept, I grant, that there are some cases where we pass a law even though the enforceability of it is limited. The most obvious example I can think of is rape, which we can't enforce all the time. We say the reason why that's different is that passing a law on rape doesn't make what happens to these people worse. We say in your world, you do. There is no legitimate signalling function here. You don't make life more respected. You get a world, not that is more respected, rather. You get a world in which lives are degraded. Lives are ruined and destroyed. Over and over again. You get a world where children die because they have nowhere else to go. You get a world where other lives are ruined because they are forced to carry the period to term. You have a world where women have no recourse of self-defense when they become pregnant through no fault of their own. And that is not the same as being raped, guys. So, I'm extremely happy to oppose this motion.
We'd like to thank the Honourable Deputy Leader of Opposition for his speech. And now, extending the case for the government benches and for Harvard A, we welcome the Member of Government.
Mr. Speaker, side opposition did something very unusual at the start of this debate, which was they conceded that the fetus was a life. They then tried to tell you why a woman's right to a free continuing career trumped the right of another individual to the basis of their very existence, their career, and everything else. We think that's problematic. And what we want to do on side government today is provide you with two extensions based on that. First, asking the fundamental question, who gets to decide when we affect the life of another? Secondly, asking, why are these lives with a difference? And thirdly, asking, how do we assess women's rights in this context? Because what we tell you, first of all, under the idea of deciding basic decisions about whether people get to live or not, that we've never granted that decision to other individuals. We haven't done so when it's come to murder, and we haven't done so when it's come to infanticide. And what we tell you is the reason that we haven't done that is that we think that individuals have a fundamental bias within these situations. We tell you that there are plenty of distressed new mothers out there who find their new baby very hard to bear. We don't think that the rights of those mothers trump the rights of the newly born baby to continue their life. We tell you, furthermore, that we think that the state is the only independent and impartial arbiter who can preside over universal moral codes. We think that's why the state invokes murder laws. We think that's why they stopped people from enslaving each other a while ago. And we think that's why they banned infanticide as well. What we tell you then is that it's very important to recognise that the existence of a third party makes this a fundamentally different scenario. It gets rid of this being an issue of the individual choice of the mother alone, or the father alone for that matter, and makes it one of who can ensure the best interest of the fetus. We think that the state is the only impartial party who can do so. Which brings us on to this question of how the state decides to draw this line. Because what we tell you at the most basic level is that there is no independent scientific basis to do it on. We tell you that scientists can't decide this question of when it's okay to kill someone because that's not a scientific question. At the point that you recognise it's a moral question, you recognise a few principles that should come into play. We think the first one is the existing society-wide presumption towards preserving life in all those instances and to not allow killing to take place. We tell you that the second one is the precautionary principle, which says that even if they have qualms, and they don't seem to have questions on the side of the House today about whether this is a life, that we're still willing to favour life above other principles like convenience, which seems to be the principle that side opposition is resting on today. Secondly then, we go to this question of how these people have suddenly become lives with a difference. How it is that they accepted at first government that these were indeed lives, but that somehow they didn't merit the full moral consideration of other human beings. Because we tell you there are a few problems with this. The first one is we don't think that there's any temporal nature to morality. We don't think that time affects the amount of rights that someone has. We think that an 85-year-old has equal rights to a 1-year-old or to a 30-year-old. And we think that's very important because a 9-month-to-be-year-old should have equal rights. What we tell you secondly is that the moral views of the parents are irrelevant to the lives of that third party. We don't think that we currently discriminate on that basis and say essentially that it's all right for someone to desert their child because they ashamed their culture or because they didn't live up to what their pre-evangelical conceptions were.
And we tell you thirdly, no thank you, that we don't think essentially that the silence of the victim is some kind of implied consent. We don't think they can say on this side of the house today that simply because the fetus is unable to say, no, I would rather not be murdered, that this is essentially consent from that party. We don't think that's an ethically sustainable standard. And so,
if the only way I can sustain my life is to attach myself to your body for the next 9 months, does that mean I have the right to demand the use of your body for my purposes?
we think there are a few problems. We think the most basic one brings us to this third question of women's rights. Because what we tell you here is that we think that there are a lot of people within society that are tied to other people for particular reasons. We point you to mentally ill patients who only survive through the help of their caregivers, but nonetheless don't give a right to cut off those people's life support. We tell you, secondly, essentially, to mothers whose babies continue to be dependent on them after birth, but nonetheless, the mothers don't get the ability to kill the baby. What we tell you is that this is not a moral standard. Being dependent upon someone else gives them absolute rights over you. We think that that's called slavery, and as a society, we abhor it. Let's go on then to this idea of women's rights. Because what we've heard essentially are all these reasons why it would be nice for women if this didn't have to take place. And we entirely agree that we would rather see no abortions in the first place, rather see no one criminalised, rather not see the need for this debate. But what we tell you is that we haven't seen any basis on the side of the house today to suppose that there is a conflicting rights claim that can be higher than that of life. Because we think that the first conflicting rights claim we had essentially was this idea that this essentially harms the future well-being of the mother. And we don't deny that. What we tell you, however, is that a lot of other things harm the future well-being of the mother. And at the point that their claim on the side of the house today is that she had a right to future further education, that she had a right to go into a career in medicine. We say that we don't currently allow a child whose parents deny them the right to go on to college or medical school the ability to kill their parents as retribution. We say that there is no basis of a right to kill on the basis of denied other opportunities. That's a very bizarre and very flimsy standard. But what we tell you furthermore here is that we don't think you can create a moral standard which concocts some kind of false equality between being pregnant and essentially being murdered. We think that there are a lot of harms that come with being pregnant, and we don't seek to downplay them. We think there are also a lot of rights that we would love that women had in place. We would love people to be able to go out and party and drink and have as much safe sex as they want. What we tell you is that those rights are fine as long as they only affect the individual mum. At the point that they come into confliction with another being's right to life, we think we do have the basis for overruling them. We think we overrule them in the status quo. What we tell you finally under this idea is that we think that someone who goes out and gets drunk currently and kills another person is not protected by the current law which recognises they had a right to have fun. We don't think there are any rights on this side of the house today that they've shown can ever go above the right to life, and we challenge them to do so. We tell you finally, essentially, that in a debate in which you have to choose between a fundamental right to life of a living being on one side and a right to convenience of mothers on the other, we will always side to right to life. We believe the state already does so. We believe they always should.
We'd like to thank the Honourable Member of Government for his speech. And now, extending the case for the opposition benches and for Oxford C, we welcome the Member of Opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you two things from my opposition extension today. The first thing I'm going to try and do is make plausible to you a justification of abortion. I'm going to stand up and give you what a woman who wanted to have an abortion might be able to say in defence of that decision. Not simply about the fact that she wants to continue to live her life, but a moral justification that she might be able to give you. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, if I've even made that first point plausible to you, then that is a plausible moral view which should be accommodated within a political community. And my second point is going to be about the role of the state and how it should legislate within that political community. Most of my rebuttal is going to be folded in as I go, but there's one particular point that I want to knock on the head before I start. And that's when they stood up right from the first proposition and said, well, drawing the line at any point is arbitrary, therefore we should ban it altogether. We say there are two issues here. The first is the principled question of where we should draw the line for agency. We say this question may be able to be answered in terms of something like sentience, in terms of something like viability. We say that's a difficult thing to do, no thank you, as they told you, but we say saying that something is a difficult moral decision to make does not make it arbitrary, and we'll give you an argument for it later. The second question, which they conflated with that first principle question, is the empirical scientific question of when you reach this whatever stage it is that you picked on principle grounds. No thanks. We say not being able to really reach a total scientific consensus about that empirical question should not stop us from trying to get as close as possible when we legislate. Ladies and gentlemen, they are committing a fallacy when they say because there is no consensus, we side with the most extreme view at one end, no thanks, with the anti-abortionists. We say often there is no consensus. That doesn't mean you draw the line in the clearest place by just going to a complete extreme. We do not believe that, ladies and gentlemen. We think that you have to accommodate different views, and that's something that we're going to talk about. Let's start with the justification of abortion, because no thanks, recognise that in almost every state which allows abortion, abortion is allowed before a certain time, before a certain week limit. We say in a lot of countries, including our own, that's based on viability. We say beyond the point of viability, no thank you, the fetus is no longer dependent on the woman in the same way. We say before that point, a fetus or an embryo has absolutely no capacity to be self-directing. And we think that harms its ability to be an agent, ladies and gentlemen, no thanks. Because we say even a baby, even a viable baby, is an agent in the basic sense that it can seek food, that it can cry, no thanks, that it can have desires that go beyond another person. We say, in the case of the coma victim that they bring up, we say that person has had self-direction, has had ideas of how they want to live their life. And we say, if you have a coma victim that is born in a coma, no thanks, and is born needing a life support machine, we often do give the family the right to turn off that life support machine, and we're willing to defend that analogy.
So,
yes, I'll take it.
So, when it's unclear and life is at question, surely the state should err on the side of preserving life.
No, we don't think that. We think when it's unclear, we should leave it to individual moral autonomy to make the decision. We think that the state is not necessarily, no thanks, in any better position to make that moral decision than individuals, and that will be my second point. So we think, ladies and gentlemen, that these kind of, that fetuses and embryos are not the kinds of agents either to which moral terms apply. Now don't get us wrong, we're not saying that once a child is viable, we start making a moral critique of its life. However, we say even tiny children can be taught about moral or appropriate behaviour as part of parenting. We say if you're not viable, you have no capacity for self-direction. We couldn't even imagine what self-directed behaviour could be like. We say that's the mark of having things like rights, being able to be a self-directed agent, and these kinds of fetuses and embryos aren't. Furthermore, we tell you that potentiality is not enough, because a sperm and an egg have potential, ladies and gentlemen. We say, no thanks, if you just can't waste potential, they need to give us a reasonable distinction, even no thanks between abortion and being celibate, ladies and gentlemen. Because we think that if they're just going to make it in terms of potentiality, that applies a whole lot earlier down the line. No thanks. We say a world in which we base, no thanks, our decisions on potentiality would be a crazy world. We would have duties left, right and centre to promote any form of potential life. We think that's a completely unreasonable world, ladies and gentlemen. And we think furthermore, no thanks, their only response to this has been to say, well, you have a special duty here because you created the embryo or the fetus. But we say that assumes that it was a deliberate act. And if that distinction breaks down, as first opposition have already shown, then that means that they can't answer that point. Let's move on to my second point about the role of the state in the political community. And we say, no thanks, that if I've even made plausible this moral case to you just now, then there are people who believe what I believe, and if the state or the government disagrees with them, as this bench does, the question now becomes, should it force them into its view of the moral universe? We say no, ladies and gentlemen, for a simple reason, because it's something they haven't recognised, which is the state does not always take responsibility for moral decision-making. We say often we leave moral decision making to the autonomy of individuals, especially when the state making the decision involves a violation of an individual's autonomy. We think there are many moral things I could do to help save lives, many of which involve this right to life, which they think is paramount. You know, I could join the fire service, I could go to Africa and help starving children, but the state doesn't make me, ladies and gentlemen, because we believe that they leave it to me to make these moral decisions. Furthermore, we say that some idea of maximising life is a totally unreasonable and demanding role for the state to take on. We think people will feel very alienated by the state under this model, and that is a harm. And we say, furthermore, the question of whether you ban abortion involves moral considerations which apply in addition to the question of whether abortion is right, like the quality of life for the child. Look at South America with its overpopulation problem. We say that is somewhere where, because of the lack of abortion, you have more miserable people. Whereas in our case, we have fetuses being aborted, which is a shame, but they are things that have no such thing as misery. We say more miserable people is a bad thing, and it's something that we stand against. We say furthermore that, as has been pointed out, in their case abortion still happens, and all the harms they point out still occur for the sake of a gesture. Finally, do you alienate all your rights by having sex? No, we think that's not true. We think that we do not enforce a state conception of morality on people because they've committed a basic human act. Having sex is not a contract with the state. You don't enter into our understanding of morality. We say there are many reasonable doctrines of morality, and we should give people the autonomy over these moral decisions when it's unclear which one is right. And it's for these reasons that we stand in opposition.
We thank the member of opposition for his speech. And now, to conclude the case for the government benches and for Harvard, we welcome the government whip.
Mr. Speaker, they tell you on their side of the house that a fetus is a life, but clearly a very strange kind of life in their minds, one that has absolutely no rights at all and no ability to make moral claims. We think that distinction is nonsense. So the first thing I want to look at is this idea of what is a fetus and what are the necessary implications of that. Then I want to look at this nonsense we've got about women's rights, and then finally I want to look at the role of the state in adjudicating between those different rights claims and why we think the state must make these kinds of decisions. So first of all, what is a fetus? We tell you, and they concede, that a fetus is a life. But more importantly, we tell you that the state must necessarily treat the fetus as a life, because there is no accepted standard of when life starts. It is not a scientific debate, it's a moral debate. And when that's the case, we should defer to the most life-friendly standard possible, the one that is most inclusive of life, the one that is most careful about life. Because we say that the role of the state is to preserve the life of all of its citizens, and thus we must have the most inclusive standard possible. Because a fetus is a life, Mr. Speaker, we think that it must therefore necessarily have full moral rights. It must have the full access to moral claims that we grant to all citizens, to all living people. Otherwise, it's not fully a life in the eyes of the state, but they tell us that it is. And just because a fetus is a particular kind of life, incapable of saying that I affirmatively want access to my rights, doesn't mean that the state can assume that it doesn't, because we point you to other kinds of silent people where we assume that they have rights, where we assume that they have access to their rights, people who aren't fully capable of accessing independently their rights. We talk to you about, for example, people dependent fully on their caregivers and why they still have full rights. And we were given this kind of silly nonsense about how this is like a personal life support. Like, yes, they're both silent. On the other hand, what we tell you is that a fetus will definitely, without human intervention, become a living person. That isn't true. A living person with full access to rights and full autonomy. That isn't true of a person on life support, so we think that is a moral distinction. The reason that a family in that case can make that decision is because there is no definite prospect of life ever arising in a meaningful way again for that person. It's just not true of a fetus. No thank you. So women's rights. And we were told, and we never disputed, that having a baby is inconvenient and possibly very, very damaging in terms of a woman's life. That it can affect career choices, that it can affect how she sees herself, that it can affect issues as fundamental as identity, and it can make you sick. Well,
A mentally ill person can be cared for by any number of people. It does not demand the total surrender of all autonomy and selfhood of one particular person, which is what you think being a moral Christian is right to do. That's good. This leads directly into the clash about women's rights, because we don't think being a mother is the same as a total extinction of autonomy and selfhood. We think that's the end of life, and that's the only moral distinction in terms of that. Being a mother is just not the moral equivalent of being murdered, and they haven't demonstrated that it is. So we think that's very, very important. No, thank you. Finally, we were told that women didn't consent to have these babies, so they have the moral right to extinguish this life. We think this is quite silly. One, because there is an exception in this model for rape to deal with issues of consent, but more importantly, no thank you. We think, yes, they did consent if they had sex to the possibility of becoming a mother. We think that you cannot possibly consent to sex unless you're consenting to the full range of possibilities that leaves open to you. No thank you, including pregnancy. So yes, in the morally relevant sense, they did consent, and thus they have chosen, no thank you, to be associated with this other life that's attached to them. Okay, so the role of the state in adjudicating between these different rights then, and we think this is pretty simple. Until they've shown you that being pregnant or being a mother or changing the way you see yourself if you're transgendered is the equivalent of being murdered, we think the state is okay in stepping in and stopping you from taking another life because you got upset. And we think that's what's been entirely missing from their analysis. Having accepted that a fetus is a life, no thank you, they've entirely failed to include them in weighing the different rights claims that they're making. If they take seriously their claim that a fetus is a life, then its life must outweigh the rights of a mother to a more convenient lifestyle. No thank you. Okay, no thank you. We were told that the state cannot force you into supporting other life. And the examples we were given were things like the state can't force you to go to Africa and feed poor people. We think that's a bit of a silly distinction. What we're talking about is the state preventing you from actively taking a life, Mr. Speaker, and we think that's what abortion necessarily is if we accept their claim that a fetus is a person. So finally what we tell you is that life must always be the primary value that the state will defer to. Not convenience, not feeling identified as a man rather than a woman, not any other consideration that they've brought us up. And the reason that must be so is that life is the foundation of all those other rights. But I'll take the first one.
Why should it always be the state that makes the moral decision in this case?
Wonderful. Because the woman can't. Because if we accept that it's a right to life, if we accept that it's something on the scale of taking a life away from another person, then it is simply not fair or reasonable, no thank you, to expect one of the involved parties to make that decision. But there is bias involved. That it is not fair on the fetus and it's not fair on the mother to expect them to be able to make that decision. We don't allow individuals to decide whether or not they want to murder someone just because they're out of the womb. We don't accept that there is necessarily a moral distinction at birth. We accept that we don't allow the woman after birth to kill the child due to reasons of inconvenience or other reasons when they feel that their life has been changed and they don't like it anymore. Just because the fetus hasn't been born yet is not a relevant moral distinction, and it's certainly not one that we think the state should be taking account of. Of course the state should be adjudicating this, just like it adjudicates all major moral decisions, like when it's acceptable to kill people. In cases of self-defense, Mr. Speaker, we accept that sometimes that's a necessary trade-off that we have to make. A life for a life. We simply haven't been shown an equivalently necessary trade-off on their side of the fence. They've talked about grave inconvenience, they've talked about changing your life, but they haven't shown that that is the equivalent of ending your life or the moral equivalent of doing so. If they accept, as they must necessarily as a state, that a fetus is a life, or that the state cannot draw the distinction meaningfully between a fetus and a life, then they must accept an end to all abortions now, and we are very proud to stand in front of it.
We'd like to thank the Honourable Government Whip for his speech. And now to conclude the round for us today and the opposition benches, we welcome the opposition.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the speaker before me said that on opposition we tell you that the fetus is alive. We very explicitly do not. We tell you what happens when we don't know. In fact, they've claimed that they embrace uncertainty. They don't. At various points during Prop Bench, they rely on the fact that this is a life while claiming that they cannot be certain of that fact. That is why we oppose them today. We say I'm going to give you three things in my speech. I'm going to talk briefly about the status of the fetus. I'm going to talk about what the demands of morality are when we are uncertain about moral entities. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about state action and moral imperatives. The status of the fetus, first of all. We say, clearly, it is possible to construct a plausible, rational, moral justification for the idea that a mother's right to autonomy may trump a fetus, that a fetus may indeed not possess rights. We heard all about that in Alex's speech. It was never dealt with in the prop sum. I'm not going to repeat it in lots of detail, but we talked, for example, about the capacity to be self-directing as a fairly plausible moral requirement of something for it to have rights that override another person's free choice. No, thank you. We say if something cannot even have aims of its own, if it cannot even live independently, we're not sure how it can have separate rights to that of the person it is dependent upon. We also might rest upon something about pleasure-pain distinction, for example, no thank you, which is where the medical line is currently drawn. To answer this, they rested upon a quite different claim that they were making than that they were making at the beginning. That actually potentiality involves life, that something that has the potential to have life is life. We say, no thank you, that's not true. Because potential objects of moral worth are not the object of moral action. It is not the case that any, no thank you, potential moral good we might create in the world create an obligation on us to create it. That would be mad. That would mean that throughout our lives, we can't, no thank you, give up any opportunity, no thanks, to increase good in the world. We say, more importantly and more clearly, this would lead to the conclusion that we should create any life we can. Ladies and gentlemen, any time I don't have sex with someone, the opportunities don't arise too often, but any time I don't have sex with someone, I am not creating a life that otherwise would exist. That is murder under their criteria. Under ours, it is not. Proclaim that they embrace uncertainty, but they don't. They don't, because they disagree with our analysis about what happens when moral claims are uncertain. So here's my second area of class. When they are uncertain, do we just play it safe? Do we secure ourselves against the riskiest possibility? No, for 5 reasons. No thanks. First of all, because if we are uncertain of the fetus's moral status, it could lie anywhere. In contrast, no thank you, we are certain of the mother's moral status. We are certain of her autonomy. We are certain of her right to life, as incidentally they concede when they accept that we should stop that we should abort when the mother's life is in danger. We say if we are certain of her rights, I'll take you in a moment. If we are certain of her rights, we can only justify curtailing them if it is the case that the fetus's status is where they claim it merely might be. So in fact, under their own lines of argumentation, we are only legitimate in doing their proposal in one possibility, and we have no idea if we're there. Go ahead.
So as Victor told you, without abortion the child will grow up and will be viable. Now you're openly conceded that future potential is justification for any life. Why then shouldn't life be the most
No, they didn't. They accepted that it might be. We gave you, and they did, various reasons why it also might not be, and we gave you the conclusions that derive from that situation. Secondly, under this second point of class, we don't play it safe to the risk of extreme possibility in the absence of an overlapping consensus anyway. It is possible, ladies and gentlemen, that we may all be going to hell if we don't go to church. That would be the most riskiest outcome of not going to church. No, thank you. The state does not therefore force us all to do that. So that would be what it might be. We think that would be mad. Thirdly, under this sub-point, there may be answers, there may be ways, as Alex told you, to distinguish this question. There might be answers that philosophy can concretely give us in terms of agency or in terms of pleasure pain. No, thank you. They just ignore this possibility. Fourthly, under this principle, we told you that the state is in no position to better decide than the mother herself or other people in society. They simply came back and claimed, oh, the mother can't because she's involved. That doesn't mean that you can't decide moral questions, ladies and gentlemen,
just because you're impacted upon them. No, thank you. Nor do we need the mother to decide. We can easily have philosophers come up with a moral justification for her, and she can use it. So we say that on all those principles, they fall. So in reality anyway, Cork aren't agreeing that the status of moral, no thank you, fetuses is uncertain anyway, because at numerous points their arguments rely on the fact that it is a life. By, as I said, no thank you, saying that the mother's autonomy is just autonomy, whereas this is a life, and therefore we have to infringe her autonomy. That is only true, no thank you, they're already, if they were already right, no thanks, that this was a life. We said they've given us no argumentation to believe that position. That is why their arguments, no thanks. 4. Finally, state actions and moral imperative. Does establishing a moral imperative, even if they had done, which they haven't, establish a state obligation to enforce it? No, because so far as moral imperatives do exist, there is not just one. The state has multiple moral imperatives that they act upon it, no thank you, to protect citizens' lives, to protect autonomy, to alleviate inequity, to ensure fairness, all of these things, no thank you. So even if abortion were clearly wrong, and there were a moral imperative to prevent it, that doesn't establish that it overrides all other imperatives. So the kill imperative, right, the save the life imperative, which they say governs all things. If that were true, if we are able to save 10 people's life in a hospital by impoverishing but keeping alive everyone else in the rest of society, the state has an obligation to do that, because nobody else dies and some lives are saved. No, we say sometimes other people's rights trump the right to life, even if we were certain, and we gave you plenty of examples about where that were true. Probably didn't accept that in their exclusion of violent rape. They accept the maximising life rule would say that even the fact that someone's been violently raped is irrelevant. So actually they're making an arbitrary distinction. They're saying that the principle of fairness is relevant in situations they like, but not in situations that we like, and that the principle of autonomy isn't worthwhile either. How does this, if they find what I know what I'm saying? How does this impinge upon the woman's autonomy, ladies and gentlemen? We've given you a clear argument that it does so in incredibly destructive ways. We said it does so because it overrides her right to decide moral questions for herself to begin with, because it saddles her in an obligation that we would never accept in any other circumstance in the world, ladies and gentlemen. Whether your Siamese twin were dying or not, we still might allow you to kill it if it preserved a status of life that was worthwhile for you, ladies and gentlemen. They're wrong about all these issues. That is why we oppose.
We'd like to thank the Honourable Whip and invite the members to cross the House and give them a round of applause. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to invite the adjudication panel to retire.